My daughter forgot to hang up the phone. I heard her say 6 words that changed everything. Dad needs to disappear quietly. I didn't say a word back. 3 months later, she and her husband came home from a cruise, tan and laughing, right up until their key wouldn't turn in the lock. On the porch, they found an envelope with her name on it. When she opened it, she dropped to her knees on the sidewalk. My name is Walter Higgins. I'm 71 years old. For 38 years, I ran a small hardware store on the edge of Millbrook, Ohio, mixing paint and cutting keys for anybody who walked through my door. I raised one daughter in the house on Birchwood Avenue, buried my wife from that house, and figured I'd die peacefully in that house too. My daughter had other plans. This is the story of how I found out, and what I did before she ever got the chance to carry them out. My wife Carol passed away a year and a half ago. In the springtime, in the hospital bed, we'd set up in our own living room so she could see the garden out the window one last time. After the funeral, the house on Birchwood Avenue felt like it had 30 extra rooms in it, even though it only had 4. I kept setting 2 coffee cups out most mornings before I remembered. My daughter Rachel called me every Wednesday night, regular as a clock, and about 4 months after Carol died, she showed up at my door with her husband Doug and an idea that sounded, right then, like the kindest thing anybody had offered me since the funeral. Dad, you shouldn't be alone in this big house, she said, standing in my kitchen with her coat still on. Doug and I have been talking. What if we moved in for a while? Keep you company, help out around the place, and save up while we look for our own house. I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in months. I said yes before she'd even finished her sentence. Within 2 weeks, they'd given notice on their apartment in Dayton and moved into the 2 bedrooms upstairs, the ones Carol and I used to joke we'd fill with grandkids someday. For a good while, it really did feel like a gift. Doug fixed the fence out back without me asking. Rachel made a pot roast every Sunday the way her mother used to. We sat on the porch some evenings and talked about nothing in particular, and for the first time since Carol died, the house had noise in it again. I told my neighbor Ellis down the street that I was the luckiest man in Trumbull County, having my own daughter looking after me. I had no idea, not the faintest idea, that the woman laughing across my kitchen table every night was already counting the months until that table belonged to somebody else, and that somebody wasn't going to be me. Around the 5th month, small things started shifting. The kind of things you talk yourself out of noticing because you don't want to know what they mean. Rachel started saying "our house" to her sister-in-law on the phone instead of Dad's place. She swapped out the curtains Carol had sewn herself, said the fabric was falling apart, though I'd looked at those curtains the week before, and they'd looked fine to me. Doug started asking more questions at dinner about my pension from the store, about whether the mortgage was paid off, which it had been since 2011, free and clear, no liens, nothing. I told myself a son-in-law ought to know these things, that it was just responsible of him to ask. One night, over meatloaf, Doug mentioned that his cousin had just sold their late mother's house in Columbus for close to $760,000, and he said it looking around my kitchen in a way that made the hair stand up on my arms, though I couldn't have explained why right then. A week after that, Rachel started inviting a woman named Sherry over for coffee on Tuesday afternoons. A woman I later found out was a real estate agent who'd already walked through my house and given them a number, back when I still thought she was just one of Rachel's friends from the gym. Looking back, I can lay it all out now like a blueprint. At the time, I just saw my daughter and her husband settling in, and an old man grateful for the company. I want you to hold on to that feeling, that trust, because it's exactly what made everything that came after Cut as deep as it did. Around the 7th month, Rachel started saying things like, "Dad, you're repeating yourself more than you used to," even on days when I hadn't repeated a single word. I misplaced my truck keys one Saturday morning, the same way I'd misplaced things my whole life. And by supper, Rachel was telling Doug across the table, like I wasn't sitting 3 feet away, that she was starting to worry about my memory. I laughed about it. Told her everybody loses their keys now and then. She didn't laugh with me. She started insisting on driving me to my checkups, even though I'd been driving myself to that same clinic for over 20 years without so much as a fender bender. And she'd sit in the exam room asking Dr. Alvarez pointed questions about forgetfulness and early warning signs, questions I hadn't asked and didn't need answered. Doug started leaving brochures on the kitchen counter, glossy ones with soft lighting and smiling silver-haired actors on the cover. Brochures for places with names like Maplewood Commons and Serenity Ridge. When I asked him about it, he said, easy as anything, "Oh, those are just something to look at, Walter, in case you ever want options down the line, down the line." That was the phrase he used. I didn't push back. I didn't want to be the suspicious old man accusing his own family over a stack of pamphlets with pictures of gardens on them. So I kept my mouth shut, kept nodding, kept thanking them for thinking ahead, while some part of me, the part that had spent 38 years reading people who tried to talk their way out of a bounced check, started paying very close attention to every word coming out of my daughter's mouth. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in May. I'd gone out to the garage looking for a can of wood stain. I knew I had somewhere, just puttering the way old men do on slow afternoons, when I heard Rachel's voice coming through the door I'd left cracked, out in the kitchen. She was on the phone talking low and quick, and I could tell by the sound of it that she thought she had the house to herself. No, listen, she was saying. The doctor already put it in his chart that his memory's slipping. That's documented now. That's exactly what we needed. Once we get him settled at Maplewood, the paperwork basically fills itself out. I stood frozen in that doorway with a can of stain in my hand, my pulse going so hard I was sure she'd hear it through the wall. She kept talking. We're not doing anything wrong here, Doug. We're talking about him getting the care he actually needs, since neither of us can be home with him all day. Doug must have said something back, because Rachel laughed. A short, tired laugh, and said, Dad needs to disappear quietly. That's just where we're at. It's not cruel. It's practical. He needs to disappear quietly, and honestly, the sooner the better, before he does something that costs us all real money. 6 words. I stood in that garage for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 90 seconds, and I didn't make a single sound. I set that can of stain down as carefully as I'd picked it up, walked back out through the side yard, and sat down on the porch steps in the May sunshine like nothing at all had happened, even though everything had. I want to be straight with you about something. My first instinct, standing in that garage, was to march into my own kitchen and ask my daughter exactly what kind of person says her own father needs to disappear quietly. Like I was an old recliner nobody wanted in the living room anymore. But I didn't do that. 38 years behind a hardware counter teaches you something useful, and it isn't how to match a paint color. It's how to keep your face still when somebody's lying to you, so you've got time to figure out exactly what they're up to before you say one single word. So that night at dinner, I ate Rachel's meatloaf and asked Doug how the job was going, same as any other Tuesday. I didn't bring up the phone call. I didn't bring up Maplewood Commons or the $760,000 or the fact that my own daughter had just talked about getting rid of me the way you'd talk about getting rid of an old car that failed inspection. I went to bed that night and didn't sleep, not for 1 minute. I lay there running back through every sweet little comment Doug had made about those brochures, every appointment Rachel had suddenly started tagging along to, every question about my pension and my mortgage and whether the house was paid off clean. It all lined up now, every piece, like a puzzle I'd been too trusting to see the shape of. Sometime around 4 in the morning, lying awake in the house I'd owned since 1993, the same house where I'd raised the daughter who now wanted me gone, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to raise my voice. I wasn't going to accuse anybody of anything to their face. I was simply going to find out exactly where I stood, legally, before either one of them got the chance to make a move against me. The following Thursday, I told Rachel I had a dentist appointment across town and drove myself there in my own truck, a 2009 Chevy I'd had since it was new. Instead of the dentist, I drove out to see a lawyer named Diane Kowalski, whose office sat above a diner on Route 46, recommended to me years back by a fellow who used to buy his lumber from my store. I sat across her desk and laid out everything, the phone call, the brochures, the questions about my finances, all of it. Diane listened without saying a word, taking notes on a legal pad, and when I finished, she pulled up the county property records right there on her screen. Mr. Higgins, she said, I want to be very clear with you. This house is deeded solely in your name, yours alone. Nobody else is on that title, and unless you've signed something granting power of attorney, nobody can sell this house, place you in a facility, or touch $1 of your money without your say-so. Then she asked me a question that made my stomach drop straight through the floor. Has your daughter or her husband had you sign anything lately? Anything they called paperwork for insurance? Or for Medicare? Or anything routine sounding like that? And it hit me all at once, a stack of papers Doug had left on the kitchen table about 3 weeks earlier, telling me they were updated homeowners insurance forms that needed my signature for the file. I hadn't signed them yet. Kept telling myself I'd get to it. Kept putting it off, because I don't sign a thing without my reading glasses and a clear head first thing in the morning. Diane told me to bring those papers in right away, and when I did, 2 days later, she confirmed exactly what we'd both already started to suspect. They weren't insurance forms at all. They were a durable power of attorney, handing Doug complete legal control over my finances, my medical decisions, and my house. I never signed that document, and I never will. But finding it changed something in me for good. I wasn't just an old man being talked about behind closed doors anymore. I was a man whose own daughter had tried to trick him into signing away his whole life on a Thursday evening, disguised as something boring enough that nobody would ever bother to read it twice. Diane helped me understand exactly where I stood, and she pointed me toward a realtor she trusted without question, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Teresa Nakamura, who worked out of an office near the county courthouse and had a reputation for closing deals fast and keeping her mouth shut when a client needed it that way. I met Teresa at a diner 2 towns over, paid cash for both our coffees, and told her flat out that I wanted to sell my house without my daughter or her husband knowing a single thing about it until it was already finished. Teresa didn't ask why. She just nodded, the way somebody nods when they've heard a version of this story more than once, and told me the market in my part of Trumbull County was strong enough that a house like mine, 3 bedrooms, a rebuilt kitchen, sitting on 3/4 of an acre on Birchwood Avenue, could realistically fetch close to $760,000 if we moved fast and moved quiet. I opened a new account at a credit union clear on the other side of town, one Rachel had never heard of, had my mail rerouted to a P.O. box, and started meeting Teresa every Thursday afternoon, while Rachel and Doug believed I was at physical therapy for my shoulder. For the first time in months, I felt like I was the one holding the cards. And I won't lie to you, it felt better than I know how to properly say. To keep Rachel and Doug relaxed and none the wiser, I did something that still puts a little smile on my face even now. I let them take me on a tour of Maplewood Commons. I walked those hallways with the soft carpet and the smell of vanilla air freshener, nodded along at the activities calendar taped up by the front desk, even told the tour guide the dining room looked real nice, all the while knowing full well I had zero intention of ever spending one night there. Doug looked so pleased with himself in the car afterward, telling Rachel on speakerphone that Dad seemed genuinely open to the idea, that I almost felt a flicker of pity for him. Almost. Meanwhile, Teresa had listed my house through a quiet, private channel that never showed up on any of the big websites Rachel or Doug might stumble across on their own, marketed only to a small handful of serious, pre-vetted buyers. Within 11 days, we had 2 solid offers. The stronger one came from a young couple, Marcus and Aaliyah Bennett, expecting their second child, who fell hard for the old maple tree out back that Rachel used to climb as a girl. Their offer landed at $760,000, all cash, flexible on closing, no contingencies, exactly the kind of clean, fast deal Diane had told me to hold out for. I sat in Teresa's office and signed that purchase agreement with a hand a lot steadier than I expected, thinking about my daughter's voice through that garage door, telling her husband that I needed to disappear quietly, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. Well, Rachel, I remember thinking as I signed my name, somebody's about to disappear quietly around here. Turns out, it isn't going to be me. About 10 days after I signed, Rachel came home from work practically floating, the way she used to look as a girl when she'd made the honor roll. Doug's company was sending them both on a company cruise out of Miami, 7 nights, all expenses covered, and Rachel was already talking about the excursions they'd booked and the formal dinner on the last night. It's actually good timing, Dad, Rachel told me over dinner, not knowing exactly how right she was. While we're gone, maybe think a little harder about Maplewood. We could even put down a deposit when we're back, get things moving. I told her I'd think it over, same even voice I'd been using for weeks by then, and inside I was already running the numbers. Diane and Teresa had told me closing could happen in as little as 10 days, once both sides signed off. And the Bennetts, pre-approved and itching to move, were ready the moment I gave the word. Rachel and Doug left for the airport on a Friday morning, suitcases stacked by the door, Rachel reminding me twice to water her ferns while they were away. I stood on the porch and waved as Doug's car backed out of the driveway, the same driveway Rachel used to chalk hopscotch squares on as a little girl, and the second that car turned the corner past the Delgado's place and was out of sight, I called Teresa and told her one simple thing. Move the closing up. Do it this week while they're at sea, before they ever get a chance to come home, and put a stop to what's already moving. The closing happened on a Tuesday, 5 days into Rachel and Doug's trip, in a small back office at the title company off Route 46. Marcus and Aaliyah Bennett sat across the table from me, Aaliyah's hand resting on her belly, both of them grinning like kids, about raising their family under that old maple tree. I signed page after page, feeling lighter with every stroke of the pen. When it was finished, Teresa handed me a check for $760,000, minus her commission and fees. More money than I'd ever held in my hands at one time in my whole life. I'd already found my next place on my own, a bright one-bedroom condo in a community called Fox Run Village, 25 minutes outside Millbrook, with a little patio out back and a wood shop in the basement I could putter around in whenever the mood struck. Nobody handed me a brochure for it. I found it myself, walked through it myself, paid for it in cash myself, and signed my own name to my own lease. I spent that Tuesday afternoon and all of Wednesday with two movers I'd hired quietly weeks in advance, packing up 30 years of a life. Carol's good china, my father's old level and hand plane, the photographs off the hallway wall, everything that actually meant something, and I left the rest for the new family, who were happy to take the furniture off my hands for a fair price. By Wednesday evening, the house on Birchwood Avenue belonged, free and clear, to Marcus and Aaliyah Bennett. The locks had already been changed by a locksmith Teresa lined up for me, and I was sitting on my new little patio at Fox Run Village, watching the sky go orange behind the tree line, a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, feeling more peace than I had in well over a year. Before I left Birchwood Avenue for the last time, I sat down at the kitchen table where Carol and I had eaten 10,000 breakfasts, and I wrote one final letter. Not to be cruel, just to be honest. I taped it to the front door, right where I knew Rachel's key would fail to turn, at eye level, in an envelope with her name written across it in the same handwriting I used to sign her report cards with. I told her I knew everything. I told her I'd been standing in that garage in May with a can of stain in my hand when I heard her tell Doug on the phone that I needed to disappear quietly, and that I'd heard her talk about the $760,000 like it was already spent and gone. I told her the house had been sold, fair and legal, to a good young family who deserved that maple tree a lot more than two people who'd spent the better part of a year plotting how to put their own father out of the way. I told her I wasn't angry anymore. Not really, just disappointed in a way that sat heavier than anger ever could, and that I hoped one day she understood exactly what it feels like to be the person somebody else decides is inconvenient. I told her not to bother trying the old phone number, since I'd already closed that line, but that I'd pick up if she ever called just to say she was sorry and actually meant it. I signed it the same way I'd signed every card to that girl since she was 6 years old, love, Dad. Then I locked that door for the last time, got in my truck, and drove off from Birchwood Avenue without once looking in the rearview mirror. Rachel told me later, though I didn't hear it straight from her for almost 3 weeks, that she and Doug pulled into the driveway on Birchwood Avenue that Friday evening, still sunburned and loose from the cruise, Rachel already chattering about unpacking and checking on her ferns. Doug walked up to the front door, key in hand, same as he'd done 1,000 times before, and it just wouldn't turn. He figured the lock was stuck, jiggled it, tried it again, called back to Rachel that something was wrong with the door. That's when Aaliyah Bennett opened it from the inside, confused, holding her toddler on her hip, asking Doug who he was and why he was trying to get into her family's house. According to my neighbor Ellis, who watched the whole thing unfold from his own front steps across the street, Doug stood frozen on the porch for a long moment before he spotted the envelope taped beside the doorframe, with Rachel's name written across the front. Ellis told me Rachel read it first, standing right there on the front lawn in the fading light, and that her hands started shaking about halfway down the page. He said Doug pulled the letter out of her hands when she couldn't get through it, read the rest himself, and that's when Rachel dropped straight down onto the grass, right there on her knees, crying loud enough that two neighbors came out onto their porches to see what in the world was going on. Ellis said Doug just stood there holding that letter, staring at a house that didn't have one single thing left inside it that belonged to him, in front of a young family he'd never laid eyes on a street he thought he'd own outright inside a year. My phone started ringing about 6 minutes later. I didn't pick up, not that night. Rachel called me 26 times over the following 3 days. I let every one of them roll to voicemail, not to be spiteful, but because I wanted her to sit for a while with the exact feeling she'd been so ready to hand me. On the fourth day, sitting out on my patio at Fox Run with the sky turning that deep orange color, I finally answered. Her voice cracked the second she heard mine. Dad, please. We didn't mean it the way it sounded. We can fix this. Just tell us where you are. I let her talk for a good while. Let her work through the apologies and the excuses about stress and bills and how things had just slipped away from her without her noticing. And when she finally ran out of words, I told her the truth as plain as I knew how. I told her I'd heard every word of that phone call back in May. I told her I knew about the power of attorney dressed up as insurance paperwork. I told her I'd known exactly what Maplewood Commons and $760,000 meant to her and Doug for months before either one of them ever said a word to my face about any of it. I told her I wasn't going to yell at her because she was still my daughter and I still loved her, but that loving her didn't mean I owed her a house. I'd spent 38 years paying off, especially not after she'd decided on her own that I needed to disappear. I told her I was happy, honestly happy, in a place I'd picked out for myself, surrounded by people my own age who treated me like a person instead of a problem to be managed. Before I hung up, I told her the door wasn't shut forever, but that it would only open back up once she was ready to see me as her father again, instead of as $760,000 standing between her and the life she thought she deserved. I set the phone down on the little table next to my coffee and looked out at that tree line one more time, feeling, for the first time in longer than I could remember, completely and finally at peace. If you've stuck with me this far, you already understand something. A lot of people your own age are starting to learn the hard way that being alone in a quiet house you own outright beats being crowded out of your own life by people who are just waiting for you to go. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me, because I don't feel sorry for myself. Not one bit. I'm telling you because somewhere out there, another mother or father is sitting at their own kitchen table right now, hearing something they weren't supposed to hear, and wondering if they're crazy for feeling what they're feeling. You're not crazy. You raised that child. You fed them, worked yourself half to death for them, signed their permission slips and their report cards, and co-signed their first car loan. And none of that ever came with a clause that says you owe them your last years too. If your own son or daughter is out there right now, measuring your house instead of measuring your happiness, you don't owe them a single square foot of it. You don't owe anybody your peace. I found mine at 71 years old, on a little patio outside a town most people have never heard of. And it is never, ever too late for you to go find yours too. Take care of yourselves out there. And to my daughter, if you're listening, the door is still there. It's just locked from the inside now, and only I get to decide when it opens.